was first discovered in Iraq, where it naturally gushed forth near the eternal fires, as described in the Bible as King Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace. Iraq was the Turkish name for the region, and oil fields were developed by the Turkish Petroleum Company. After World War I, the victorious British and French seized control of these oil fields and formed new Arab nations to act as proxies for Western interests. The stated goal of, quote, the British Mandate for Mesopotamia, unquote, was to establish nations for local Arabs, but the obvious reason was to secure oil fields. Syria was created so the French could pump its share of oil to the Mediterranean. Jordan and Palestine were occupied by the British to guard their new oil pipeline to the port of Haifa. This was part of an effort by the British, French, and Americans to monopolize the world's oil reserves. Time magazine wrote about their success in 1932. Quote, Anglo-Persian, now British Petroleum, and Royal Dutch Shell, which was largely British-owned, have seen to it that Britain's oil shall never be turned off completely. Besides the oil of the King of Kings, Iran, Britain controls nearly one-half the concession of the famed Iraq fields, split between a French group, now Total, and a U.S. group, the Standard Companies, now Exxon-Mobil, plus Andrew William Mellon's Gulf Refining, now called Chevron. Iraq has the world's third largest oil reserves, and most are easily accessible. Its modern history is one of exploitation by Western oil companies, backed by Anglo-American military force. Western control over Iraqi oil was lost as operations were gradually nationalized. This happened in all oil exporting nations as their governments became sophisticated and learned to read oil contracts and understand their consequences. They also realized that Western oil companies cheated them whenever possible and openly engaged in domestic political manipulations, to include bribery and coups. A summary of the situation was provided by oil executive Dick Cheney in 1999. Quote, producing oil is obviously a self-depleting activity. Every year, you've got to find and develop reserves equal to your output just to stand still, just to stay even. This is true for companies as well in the broader economic sense as it is for the world. So where is the oil going to come from? Governments and the national oil companies are obviously controlling about 90% of the assets. Oil remains fundamentally a government business. While many regions of the world offer great oil opportunities, the Middle East, with 2/3 of the world's oil and the lowest cost, is still where the prize ultimately lies. Hopes for this prize arose with the election of George W. Bush in 2000. Along with a prominent oil executive as vice president. Dick Cheney had led Halliburton downhill during his 5 years as CEO. He oversaw the disastrous merger with sickly Dresser Industries and a failed effort to develop an oil field off Brazil. Despite these horrible results, Halliburton awarded him a $20 million bonus when he resigned to join the Bush campaign. After the 2000 election, Cheney formed an energy task force and held secret meetings with major oil company executives. The conclusions of this task force remained secret until 2002, when a FOIA lawsuit by Judicial Watch forced their release. The documents included maps of Iraqi oil fields and lists of foreign oil firms interested in specific Iraqi oil fields. Seizing Iraq's oil reserves for export by Western oil companies was the best solution to Dick Cheney's question, quote, so where is the oil going to come from? The Bush administration declared Iraq a serious threat, and the U.S. military began flying weapons into northern Iraq to arm Kurds and encourage them to conduct terrorist attacks against the Iraqi government, while the U.S. military stepped up occasional airstrikes against Iraqi military targets. These activities were never sanctioned by the UN and were clearly illegal under international law. In 2003, as U.S. forces prepared to invade Iraq, President Bush demanded that Saddam Hussein prevent UN inspectors, quote, free and unfettered access, end quote, to search Iraq for WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. Hussein surprised everyone by agreeing, and UN inspectors were allowed to roam Iraq at will and check all the locations that Colin Powell had recently told the UN Assembly were actively producing illegal weapons. After several weeks, the dozens of UN inspector teams had found nothing, and the dirty, rusty conditions of the suspect sites showed nothing had been made there for years. The Bush administration insisted they had other proof of WMDs in Iraq. Chief UN Inspector Hans Blix publicly stated that, quote, 700 inspections were conducted, and in no case did we find weapons of mass destruction, end quote. He told the press that the United States would send him a clue. He would have UN teams inspect any site the next day. Iraq even proposed that U.S. military officers join the UN inspectors. As a result, President Bush had perfect intelligence that Iraq had no WMDs. This confirmed what General Hussein Kamel, Iraq's weapons chief who defected from Iraq in 1995, told UN inspectors and the CIA that Iraq had destroyed its entire stockpile of chemical and biological weapons and banned missiles. CNN aired an interview with Kamel, linked below, where he confirmed Iraq no longer had WMDs. By 1998, most UN members wanted sanctions removed since UN inspectors had found no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq for years, but the United States blocked proposals to lift sanctions. There were other reasons the USA invaded and occupied Iraq. Americans' weapons contractors are always supportive of actions that result in more contracts. The U.S. military wanted justification for a larger force and budget. American generals sought their chance to organize and lead major combat forces, especially against a clearly inferior enemy that had no desire to fight. The presence of permanent American air bases in Saudi Arabia angered many Muslims. These were promptly closed after the air bases in Iraq were ready for American aircraft. In the 1990s, the U.S. military began to contract much of its combat service support functions to private firms. Companies like Halliburton raked in billions of dollars supporting operations in Albania, Kosovo, and elsewhere, and they wanted more. Supporters of Israeli territorial expansion wanted to replace yet another opposing Arab nation with a docile Western public regime like those of Egypt and Jordan. All these forces played upon George W. Bush's vision of grandeur as a wartime president. The evidence is overwhelming that the primary reason the U.S. military invaded Iraq was to return control of Iraq's oil reserves to Western oil companies. Profits from Iraqi oil now flowed to big oil companies rather than Iraqis. Knowledge that a control of oil reserves is the prime objective in Iraq is so widespread among Washington, D.C. insiders that the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, wrote in his memoir, The Age of Turbulence, quote, I am saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil. After American troops invaded Iraq and found no WMDs, new justifications arose. It was claimed that Saddam Hussein killed 5,000 Kurds with poison gas in 1988, despite public reports from the United States Defense Intelligence Agencies and CIA analyst Stephen Pelletiere that Iran was responsible, a claim that Pelletiere repeated in a 2003 op-ed in the New York Times. Some claim that invading Iraq was justified because of its support of terrorism, even though Iraq had never been tied to international terror acts. No Iraqis were involved in the 9/11 attacks. Iraq's secular government was the most progressive in the Arab world, and thus often criticized by fundamentalists like Osama bin Laden. He referred to Saddam Hussein as an infidel because Iraq protected freedom of religion for Christians and Jews and allowed women to wear Western clothing, drive cars, and attend college. In his last speech before Congress voted on the Iraqi invasion, link below, President Bush made no mention of these issues, but stated there was no doubt that Iraq was a threat to the United States because it possessed tons of WMDs. In recent years, it was announced that proof of Iraqi WMDs was finally found. This was true, but misleading. Construction projects unearthed a few rusty, unusable chemical munitions that were buried and forgotten during Iraq's war with Iran in the 1980s. After the easy conquest of Iraq, President Bush appointed a wealthy Washington, D.C. insider to transform Iraq into an American colony. L. Paul Bremer III had no military experience, no civil administration experience, and no experience in the Arab world. Bremer quickly disbanded the Iraqi army, fired thousands of government administrators and educators, and announced that Iraq's oil industry would be privatized. These actions infuriated Iraqis, resulting in an armed rebellion. According to the United States Department of Defense, over 4,500 American GIs were killed in Iraq and over 32,000 wounded. Estimates of the number of Iraqi civilians killed in the war vary wildly. Some count only those killed directly, while estimates that include indirect deaths caused by destroyed infrastructure exceed 1 million lives. The United States government borrowed over $1 trillion to pay for this conquest, and billions of dollars are spent each year caring for Iraq war veterans and family members of those killed. President Bush's outrageous lie was that he did not deceive the American people to justify the invasion of Iraq. "We were fooled by bad intelligence," is the excuse still accepted by most Americans. World leaders knew this was a lie, which is why Bush failed to get a majority of the UN Security Council to pass a resolution authorizing the use of force against Iraq. As a result, the invasion of Iraq was clearly illegal under international law, and American troops still occupy and quietly control Iraq even today. President Bush knew there were no WMDs in Iraq before the invasion, as did most American congressmen and our corporate media, because Blix told them so. Bush faked proof to accomplish his secret mission of returning control of Iraqi oil fields to Western oil companies. Exxon-Mobil, Shell, Total, and British Petroleum are now the biggest producers of Iraqi oil. The fact that President George W. Bush knowingly lied about the purpose of invading Iraq is hard for most Americans to accept. This is never mentioned in our corporate media because they fear upsetting Americans, who prefer to think of their leaders as incompetent buffoons rather than greedy mass murderers.